And buonasera a tutti. Good evening, y'all, and thanks for tuning in tonight, Saturday on January 25th, 2025, episode 54 of What's the Scoop. Hope everybody had a wonderful week. Looking forward to getting into it this weekend. We had some coaching searches get filled up in the NFL. We had some controversy around at least one, if not a couple of them, depending on how you view it. We're going to know tomorrow what teams are going to represent in Super Bowl 59, which will take place 2 weeks from tomorrow on February 9th. And of course, as per usual, when we've got trade deadlines approaching in both NBA and NHL, and spring training approaching in Major League Baseball, after just having had the Hall of Fame announcements this past week, there's going to be, as usual, no shortage of topics to cover this evening in all major sports across America. So, if there's anything that you want to talk about, if there's any questions on your mind, anything I want to hear what you've got to say. I want to hear what you're thinking. I want to hear what your reactions are to some of these topics, or something that you want to talk about, or even if you've just got a response to something that I said, to jump right in on that chat. I'm looking forward to engaging with all y'all tonight. Excuse me. Before we get into that, I also just do want to throw out there, anybody who's watching this from, someplace, whether it's, California, that's had everything going on with the fires, catastrophes recently, or down here in the Gulf Coast with what's happened with the last couple of weeks where things got unseasonably cold and a lot of the southeast got either snow or ice or at least frigid wind chills. Just want to express that I hope everybody's doing okay. I hope everybody's safe. And thanks again for tuning in with me for the next 60. And I'm looking forward to spending it with y'all. So I think that there's probably no more opportune place to start than with the big game tomorrow. Super Bowl number 59 is, I'm sorry, the participants for Super Bowl number 59 is how I meant to phrase that are going to be determined with tomorrow's games. The Eagles are playing pardon. The Eagles are playing the rival Washington Commanders, and the Kansas City Chiefs are playing their rival Buffalo Bills. So it should be a pair of great games. Looking forward to watching both. Definitely know that a lot of my family and friends back in my hometown of upstate New York, I know are going to be on the Buffalo side. I've gotten more than I can count messages this past week of people sending me just pictures and all geared up for this week. So I know that after multiple difficult losses, including several to the Chiefs in the last few playoffs, I know that it would mean a lot to Buffalo and Western New York at large, and of course Bills Mafia, to be able to finally slay that beast and to be able to represent the AFC in the Super Bowl. And then of course we've got the Commanders, who just had the upset over the Detroit Lions last week. My guy Jaden Daniels over there is continuing to make my calls last year for him to be the first pick and the first quarterback off the board in the 2024 draft, continuing to make those age well. Unfortunately, he's doing it in the same division as my Eagles, but I'm still obviously excited for him, still happy for him, and congrats to the Commanders. They finally have some stable ownership. They finally have a good front office. They got qualified and respected adult in the room at head coach in Dan Quinn, and then of course the offensive staff that they've got over there, led by someone who I've spoken highly about, which is offensive coordinator Cliff Kingsbury. So I'm looking forward to seeing both games tomorrow. Hopefully it's a pair of good games. Hopefully it's games that are defined by the talent on the field and the production on the field, and not by a janky call or questionable thing that could have gone either way, that was not defined by actual performance on the field. Because I think we all know that it's more fun that way when it's not a quote unquote rough show. We got the comments coming in. My buddy Kurt says, "What's up, Scoops? Good luck to you and your Eagles tomorrow." Kurt, thank you so much. I hope you're doing well. Hope you and Jenny Hoops and Bo are all doing well, and appreciate it. Looking forward to the game, and I'm sure that our little network, if you want to call group chat, I'm sure we'll have plenty to say during both games. I'm looking forward to it. So thank you for that. And yeah, so I do want to look into both of these games, because it's been quite interesting to me to look at. I've been following sort of not just the betting lines, but I think that's kind of a good microcosm for how not just markets but people in general are looking at these games and what they expect. And I'm gonna go into the first game just chronologically speaking, which is Washington versus Philadelphia. Now, obviously, the big elephant in the room when it came to the Eagles was the health of a couple of players, particularly obviously that starting with Jalen Hurts. My understanding, based on what's been talked about the last couple of days, is that even though he's avoided the injury, he has avoided the injury report, and he's full clear to play. Although they are still having, of course, some concern about his knee, which is hardly surprising at all, based on obviously he's been banged up a lot the last couple of weeks, and that continued when he got that knee injury this past weekend against Los Angeles. But he was a full participant in practice yesterday, so that's obviously a step in the right direction. I wouldn't be surprised if you see them try to utilize him more traditionally, if you want to say. I wouldn't be surprised if you see less, schemed out and less sort of drawn up quarterback run plays. I wouldn't be surprised if they try and lean off of that a little bit, just because I know the last thing they want to do is risk potentially losing him for the rest of that game, and God forbid going into a potential Super Bowl if they were to win that. So, but in terms of the other injuries that the Eagles are dealing with, most of the guys that had been banged up have been cleared fully to play. They got 3 questionables as of when this was, excuse me, as of when this was put out, but. They had a lot of guys return back to as well. Dallas Goedert returned on Friday. Cam Jurgens returned on Friday. The Commanders actually were the team that had a little bit more concerning news come out. Deron Payne, for those who didn't see, was designated that he was. It was uncertain whether he was going to be able to suit up tomorrow, and I know that they had some concerns about a couple of other players as well. So. Not 100% certain in terms of some of those logistics, but obviously hoping on both sides that everybody's going to be healthy and available going into tomorrow's game. And now looking at it aside from the injury perspective, looking at it from just more of a full team zoomed out perspective, definitely think that across the board, if you're looking at the more potent offense, I think I would say, I think a lot of people would say that in terms of when you include quarterback and passing ability, you just can't deny what Jayden Daniels has done for Washington this year. He's had not only a great rookie season, he's had perhaps the greatest rookie QB season in modern football history, which has been impressive to watch. He has led them. I mean, last week, very few people I think saw them beating Detroit in Detroit. But we're looking at 3 road wins in a row that he's pulled off now. He's pulled off road wins earlier in the season against teams like the Bengals, against teams like Arizona, and a lot of this happening when I think a couple weeks into the season. I think he was still getting his feet wet. But even the losses that they had suffered. I mean, we're looking at a 1-score loss to Baltimore, who was considered perhaps the most complete team in the AFC. A 1-point loss to Pittsburgh, who in the beginning of the season was playing very well. A 1-score loss to Philadelphia, who they came around and beat again later in the season. And then a 1-score loss to Dallas, who I'm going to get into in a couple minutes because they made news in their own right this past week, and I have no shortage of things to say about that. But I think that this is a Commanders team that definitely has proven that it just goes to show that when you get quarterback and coach right, I mean, this sounds a little bit like a no bleep Sherlock type of a thing, but when you get quarterback and coach right, it's not unreasonable at times to have situations where you have to wait a year or two, but you also have situations where you don't have to wait a year or two if you get those 2 things right. It looks like they've gotten DC right. It looks like they've gotten OC right. I don't know how Cliff Kingsbury hasn't had more interviews in the coaching cycle than he's had. But it's a strong sort of structure that they've developed and developed very quickly. And I think that that's going to not only serve them well this year, but I think that that's something that they're potentially going to be looking at for years to come. I don't think this is going to be a one and done type of a season where they caught lightning in a bottle. I think this is something that I think Washington's going to be around in the NFC East and the NFC at large for a long period of time. And then, of course, looking at the defensive side of things, that's obviously considered the more a little bit more questionable side of the ball. They're ranked in the bottom 10 on defense according to PFF, and they've had issues at times throughout the season with a couple of games that got 30, 40 points that they allowed on both at home and on the road. They were looking at, if I can just get these going here, the Commanders were looking at, 25 touchdowns and 7 interceptions that they have on offense. But then when you flip over to the defensive side of the ball, they are, I apologize, this is not coming up. There we go. But then when you look at the defensive side of the ball, the numbers that they are almost giving up about as much on defense as they were offensively. So numbers on passing, the passing completion percentage that they've allowed is 62%. They've allowed 25 touchdowns to 7 picks, according to these information. Passer rating of 94, and that passer rating of 94 is it's the top 10 in the NFL. So this might be an interesting opportunity if Philly does determine that they're going to go pass heavy, or not even pass heavy, but shift Hurts more off of the running game himself, because obviously they got the best running back season I've seen from Saquon and a couple of guys behind him. So I think that they might be in a position where they may be more comfortable than they otherwise would have been if they decide to do it that way. But I wouldn't be surprised if they leaned on him a little bit more as a more traditional, I'm not necessarily saying pure pocket guy, because I do think that obviously when you have the mobility that he does, you use it. But I wouldn't be surprised if the sort of schemed up QB movement plays are dialed down a little bit, because this is a team in Washington who has very mediocre numbers when it comes to stopping the pass. And even when you kick it over to the rushing game, or to the rushing defense, they're about the same. They've allowed 18 rushing touchdowns this year. They've allowed 2 runs of 40 or more yards, which is kind of in the middle of the pack. So again, I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad defense. This is a defense who has much more vulnerability than their offense does. I think it's much more likely that if they make a quote unquote mistake, or if they get beat in a play, or on a drive or whatever, I think it's much more likely that it'll be their defense that allows that than it will be their offense struggling to come through. But this is the other thing that's always fascinating to me, is when you've got, and of course you go over to Philly's side, Philly, you've got a little bit of the opposite situation, where in spite of the heavy run game that they've had, and the heavy success that they've had through Saquon and the offensive line, they've got a mid-ranked offense, according to according to Pro Football Focus, 18th ranked offense, but they've got the number 1 ranked defense. So you've got one team that's very defensive first, and one team that's very offense first. I do think that playing in Philly is going to play a little bit of a role of this. I have to double check and see what the active weather report, because the weather report keeps changing in terms of what it's going to look like for game time tomorrow. But according to what I've got here, it doesn't look like it's going to be anything with regarding to precipitation, and the wind doesn't look like it's going to be much of a factor either. So the weather might not be as much of a factor tomorrow, based on what the forecast looks like. But obviously, Philly is considered one of the stronger home field advantages in the NFL. So I am looking forward to watching that. But when you have the highly ranked defense and going up against a highly ranked offense, it's just fun to watch, I think, to kind of see who blinks first. Will Philly's top ranked defense, will someone get, beat on a blown coverage or something like that? Please no. Or will it be on the offensive side? for Philly will Saquon take it to the house, and it'll be the defensive side on then Washington that ultimately causes them their Achilles heel, if you want to say. But coming off of that, I am gonna jump in real quick. I'm gonna talk about that Dallas point in a minute, but I do also want to talk about the other game first. Now, this line is held pretty steady for most of the week. It's kind of hung around a little bit between 1.5 to 2.5 in favor of Kansas City. So around that 2-point mark. It's pretty clear that they don't expect this game to be decided by more than a field goal. So that doesn't entirely surprise me. I said earlier this season that even though the Chiefs have had a better record than the Bills for most of the season, I think that the Bills have played more like a 15 or 16 win team than the Chiefs have, from the numbers that I see, but also from the times that I've gotten to watch them. I think the Chiefs now are a more complete team than they were a couple years ago, in the sense that they're not relying any more on Tyreek being sort of their main guy downfield, which that's a Don't Saga out in Miami right now. But I think that the question will be, or one of the questions will be, can Buffalo's defense? We've heard for a while that Buffalo's bread and butter was supposed to be their defense, and now this year I think they've got their front front seven are still guys that I think, a lot of them have still had very solid seasons, from Rousseau to Oliver to out corner. You've got Bedford and a couple of others. But the deeper back you go, when you get to the linebacking and the safety core, they're not the same aggression, and they're not the same depth and productivity this season that we've seen in past years for Buffalo's defense. In contrast, I think that on the flip side, when you put the Chiefs on the defensive side of the ball, I think the Chiefs have had a little bit of a better or at least deeper of a defense than we've seen at times in the last few years. But I think Buffalo also has an offense where I don't really know what you're looking at as this is your the whole type of thing. In terms of you're gonna double out this guy, and then you're gonna make this other guy beat you who's not as strong. Even if they put whether it's Coop, whether it's Coleman, whether it's Shakir, whether it's Kincaid, any one of those guys can beat you at any given moment. And then the offensive line, their lowest ranked offensive lineman is the right guard, Torrance, and even he is ranked about average when it comes to players at his position. Which, if that's your weakest player on your entire offense, then you don't have a lot of places to be stopped. So, I think it's interesting because these teams have faced each other so many times the last few years, but every time they faced each other, it's been such a different version of what makes them so good and what makes them so formidable. For a while, Josh Allen was helter-skelter in terms of production, but their defense and some of what they were able to do with their weapons was helping carry them and their physicality. And then on the Chiefs side of things, for a while it was, like I said, it was that downfield. They're gonna knockout punch you with Tyreek and all of that. And then now this is, I think, the third or fourth matchup that these teams have had in a big game the last few years. And again, every time it seems like a different iteration of both of these teams, but they both have just been, always among one of the top couple of teams remaining in the AFC, really, since both these two quarterbacks came into the league in 2017, 2018. I do stand by my prediction a few weeks ago. I do think that this is going to be the year that Buffalo dethrones them. And I will say this: I've come down hard on Josh Allen several times for different reasons. I think that he many times has put his team on his back, but I think many times he's also unnecessarily put his team in harm's way. And this year, particularly last week against Detroit, he didn't play necessarily the most heroic game of football. He didn't play the most sort of, put the cape on and go win it for us type of football that we've ever seen from him. And I was glad to see that. And I was glad to see that because I I said Detroit. I'm sorry. I meant to say Baltimore. Let me just correct myself there. My apologies. But when we go up against Baltimore, and they came down and they ended up winning by 2 in the fourth quarter, they went in and he was not ever looking like he was trying to save the day, playing it down, deep downfield. He didn't even have a single touchdown pass last week. Pretty pedestrian passer rating at 87. He wasn't trying to, and he didn't have to. And I'm glad that he didn't try to do something he didn't have to do in terms of, always trying to, make the huge play and then ended up putting the ball into harm's way. He got sacked once last week, and he only had half the passing yards of Lamar, but he didn't throw any picks, and he didn't put the team in harm's way, and I am really glad to see him play a more clean, crisp brand of football than we're used to seeing from him. Because again, I said something, as much as I have been critical of him in the past, I've made similar criticisms of both him and Jalen Hurts this year, which is because they're so talented, I think at times they feel like they owe it to their team to put the team on their back and to go out there and try and single-handedly save the day. And it can work, but if it's not a situation where it's absolutely necessary, like that's an emergency break glass type of situation. So, I felt like both of them, I feel like both Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts at times overuse that. I think that they use it more than they have to. And I think that the overuse of that puts it in a position where it becomes more of a potential liability, because if it goes awry, then you potentially cost yourself significantly in an area where taking that risk was just unnecessary. And I've seen it happen multiple times for both teams, for both quarterbacks, and I am glad to see that in Allen's case. I'm glad to see that he was not prone to that so far this as much this postseason, particularly last week against Baltimore. I also, it's kind of a nice story as well. The defensive leader last week against Baltimore on tackles and on complete tackles and solo tackles was Damar Hamlin. He also tied for the lead in tackles for loss. He got one of the sacks and he forced a fumble. Was pretty much the main guy on defense for Buffalo, and I know a lot of people enjoyed watching that. Mr. Burns says, watching from Cedar Hill, Texas. Mr. Burns, I hope you're doing well. Thank you for tuning in this weekend, and I hope you had a good week. Hope everybody's staying well down there. I don't know exactly about what Cedar Hill got with regard to some of the weather that's hit this area, this region the past week or so. But a buddy of mine is coming in. He's actually driving in tonight from Texas, a little more toward the Houston area, I think. And he said that his travel back was delayed by a couple of days because of what y'all were dealing with, or at least where he is. But I know that obviously I don't necessarily know if that's particularly close to you. But that being said, not a ton more to really get into the nitty gritty on with regard to Buffalo versus Kansas City tomorrow. My predictions for both games remain the same. I do still think it's going to be Eagles versus Bills. I do still think that Buffalo, especially because their biggest question, I said this a few weeks ago, that my biggest question to them was, as I just said, was can Josh Allen clean himself up to the point where I don't feel like he's going to be where the spigot can leak. And he has done about as well as I could have asked him to do the last couple of weeks in terms of demonstrating that he has the ability to put those issues behind him. And with that, coupled with what I mentioned earlier about how I don't really see a hole in that offense that the Chiefs can really sort of expose or penetrate or utilize, or however you want to say. I think that puts them in a strong position where as long as a couple of the guys on defense, Cook has had a bit of a struggle season. A couple of their defensive linemen have been good, although not as not fantastic, but for the most part they've been good, but they've got a couple who haven't been fantastic. If they're able to accomplish that, then I think that you're putting yourself in a position where I'm going to have a hard time seeing, even with Mahomes on the Kansas City side. I think it's the way that the rosters are structured. I think that you could convince me that, well, it's Mahomes, so he's going to find a way. You could convince me of that against almost any team, but other than maybe Baltimore, this is probably the one team where I look at it and I'm just saying, and I think that this is a team that does not have a favorable matchup for Kansas City, even when factoring in what Pat Mahomes can do. I want sound off on the Cowboys not trying hard enough to find a new coach to replace McCarthy. Well, that's as good of a segue as any into what my next topic was going to be, because, okay, so you win it. If you're the Dallas front office, if you're their ownership, the front office, it doesn't have to just be Jerry. It can be that whole his whole regime. You go into this season knowing that your head coach and your assistant coaches, all their contracts were about to expire. It comes down to the day that those contracts are set to expire, and you still have pretty much had no back and forth with this coach. You're still hemming and hawing over whether you want to keep him or not. He calls you on it because, not just because of that, but because he's upset for his assistants who have been hanging in the balance, because they all have jobs or I'm sorry, they all have families and one thing or another, and just things that they have to worry about as well. But they don't have McCarthy's name recognition. They don't have his cachet and one thing or another. So people aren't thinking about them in the same light. But these are a whole bunch of people who have gone through this whole last season not knowing what their future holds, and now it's coming down to literally the final hours before their contracts expire, and in terms of whether they're going to be brought back or not. So they still haven't gotten that decision. And then McCarthy, pretty much ostensibly trying to sort of stick up for them, basically says, I'm not coming back. This has not been fair to the guys that I've coached with, and all of that. So then Dallas needs a new coach. Then we find out a few days later Dallas didn't expect to need a new coach because they didn't expect to lose McCarthy. Don't know how you don't expect to lose McCarthy when you don't even make McCarthy an offer, and when you go through it. And I know that it's not, it's not in and of itself innately rare for coaches to go into the final year of their contracts with a little bit of uncertainty, but to close out your contract year with pretty much no discussion having taken place about, actual figures about what next year's contract would look like, or the next contract would look like, is insane to me. And so I'm looking at not only the way that they handled the McCarthy thing, but then to find out that he didn't expect to lose McCarthy, which, again, I don't know exactly what he was looking at when he expected or didn't expect that, but I think that that's about as tone deaf as you can get with regard to way to have your finger on the pulse of your own organization. That if you say no one can run the organization like you do, I think that there's a lot of people out there who could have been able to piss off a coach enough to not have him want to come back by the fact that they didn't even try to negotiate with him, or the fact that they didn't make it clear to him or his assistants what they wanted to do his entire contract year. I think that's, if you say that there's no one in the world who could do that the same way you do, I would strongly disagree with you on that. And then we're looking at the guys who interviewed for Dallas. It was Leslie Frazier, who's been the associate head coach for the Seahawks. There was supposedly mutual interest that was expressed with Anthony Lynn, who was at one point the LA Chargers coach and is now the running back coach for the Washington Commanders. There was Kellen Moore, the offensive coordinator in Philadelphia, who a lot of people thought was, including myself, thought was a front runner at one point. There was Robert Saleh, who, in fact, just was announced today, going back to the 49ers as defensive coordinator. So it's not like they were looking around and, it's not like they were looking around and not able to get these guys coming in for interviews, or that a lot of teams were, declining to come in. I think a lot of people, got caught up in and kind of, fell in love with the idea of Deion going there or Jason Witten going there. And again, I thought Jason Witten would have been a very strong fit, but it doesn't sound like the Deion thing was ever considered particularly likely, the way that some fans and maybe some people in the media either wanted it to be or at times portrayed it to be. But you've got some at least legitimately qualified and experienced coaches there, if not at the head coaching level, then at least as coordinators. And I think that you could have made a strong case for a couple of them. And then we find out a couple days ago that they are hiring Brian Schottenheimer, who was the offensive coordinator from the staff that they just parted ways with because their contracts expired. The right-hand man to the coach who you just spent an entire year hemming and hawing about whether you wanted to bring him back. A coach who has been at the epicenter of your quagmire of mediocrity the past few years. The coach who has been at the oversight of the stagnation of the production of Dak Prescott as the support around him has started to diminish over time, over a period of years, because surprise, surprise, when you pay $50 million to a quarterback who's not worth $50 million, you can't keep some of the talent around him, and some of the guys who become available aren't necessarily champing at the bit to come over and flock over to you. Not everybody's looking to go and play, for a team that's set to go 10-7 and lose in the first round of the playoffs because they won rings 30 years ago with Jimmy Johnson before Jerry Jones kicked them out. Not a lot of players, are necessarily lining up to do that. So you have all that coming together. And aside from the fact that they brought in somebody who, or not even brought in, that they promoted somebody who had that same connection or basically was just more of the same already. But this is somebody who he's been an offensive coordinator the last few years. He coached in Jacksonville for a year. He was the OC in Seattle for 3 years. He was an assistant for the Colts, assistant for Georgia, the Georgia University of Georgia, St. Louis Rams offensive coordinator, Jets offensive. So this guy's been a career offensive coordinator since going back to the mid 2000s. Was a quarterbacks coach for a couple teams before that, and then came up through as a position coach at a couple of different schools, including Syracuse and USC. So this is a guy who's coached offense at the NCAA and NFL level for about almost 30 years, and this is his first head coaching job. Not his first head coaching job just at the NFL level, his first head coaching job for a coach who's been coaching since the Baltimore Ravens hadn't even existed yet. So, it was, in fact, he started when the Cleveland Browns had already gone inactive, but hadn't come back yet in '99. And after all this time, and he became a candidate for jobs 15 or so years ago at the head coaching level. He was interviewed after Eric Mangini was fired by the New York Jets when they ultimately hired Rex Ryan, who I'm still disappointed didn't get a coaching job. But he was considered for a job in Buffalo, but ultimately did not interview there. So all of these different opportunities, where he was either interviewed or he at least was under consideration. And we've not heard any sort of significant connection between him and any head coaching job for the most part since then, in almost closer to 20 than 10 years. So, yeah, you can try and sell me that they see something in him from him being internal the last couple of years. They see something in him that other teams didn't. Or that, from his familiarity with the whole system or the whole, what Dak has been able to do versus not do, and what his strengths are, what his weaknesses are. The way that the offense has kind of gone through different iterations, from when they were very Zeke heavy to when they were more CeeDee Lamb heavy to when they were having more going more through Jake Ferguson at times. So you can try and sell me on that. My cynical aspect of my mind looks at this and simply believes this was the guy who was most likely to be comfortable under the thumb of Jerry Jones and perhaps Stephen Jones. That is what I take away from this, because I said, and y'all remember, I said this probably more than once when we were going back, and when it became clear that Mike McCarthy was not going back to Dallas, I said, and I laid out different names of people who either I thought would be good fits or people who were being suggested as good fits. And one of the things that I said, when we were talking about guys like Witten, we were talking about guys like Sanders and a couple others, and I said, I think these are guys who are going to be good coaches, perhaps even head coaches in the NFL at some point. But I would not have looked even remotely close to the current Dallas Cowboys for the next head coach, because they have made it so clear with this sort of pseudo nepotistic mentality that Jerry Jones has, where his ego is so outsized that he is somehow deluded into the idea that because he's such a branding czar, that he also is great at football. When a modicum of self-evaluation of the situation would not bear that out at all. And where you go back to the last 30 years, they are the only team in the past, they are the only team in the past 30 years to not, to not be able to, or to achieve a seed as high as they've achieved a couple of years ago, and to not be able to advance past the first round. And I could go on about a million other stats that talk about how they have short-circuited with regard to playoff success. But again, we keep being told that, how about them Cowboys and America's team? For a team that has not been able to win past the first round of the playoffs consistently in 30 years, and the idea for Jerry Jones was, nobody can run this team better than I can, and I want more of the same for what we've been doing recently. So they weren't happy enough with where things were to re-sign the coach that was at the helm of it all, but they were happy enough with it to promote somebody from internal who's never been a head coach before and who hasn't been seriously considered as a head coach by any team in the NFL in almost 20 years. That was the mentality of what Jerry Jones thought he could do by needing to change but wanting to sort of stick with what he was comfortable with at the same time. I feel bad for Dallas Cowboys fans. I really do. Because for a while, under the Jason Garretts of the world, or even going back to the Chan Galeys of the world, for a while, this team they weren't obviously winning Super Bowls, but they were consistently relevant. They seemed to be at least decently well run. And they were kind of like the Yankees between 2001 and 2008, or between 2010 and 2023 or 2022, which was, they weren't really winning the big thing, but they were always relevant right to the very end. This organization now just looks like a dumpster fire. And not only do they look like a dumpster fire, because at least organizations like for example, Washington, I'll use as an example. Washington, at least the owner. Now, it was a very interesting article that came out about Dan Snyder, where he basically, the day that he was supposed to sell the team to the Harris Group, he tried to intervene at the last second and prevent him from selling the team to the point where he literally, pretty much almost literally went kicking and screaming when the sale was transacted at about 2:00 in the morning. Highly recommend going to read that article. I believe it was on it was either on The Athletic or ESPN. I have to double check which, but highly recommend reading that article. But even him, who was considered almost universally the worst or one of the worst owners in recent, not just football history, but sports history, when he was, eventually he was, gotten out, they brought in a new ownership, new GM, new coach, new quarterback, and within about 2 years, we've seen that things, have strongly turned around. The fact that Jerry Jones won't even hire a new general manager, forget about selling the team, won't even hire a new general manager, won't even hire a top personnel executive that doesn't share his surname. This is bad for Dallas and for Dallas fans. This is not a good situation. And credit to Dallas fans, because some of them are actually being objective about it, and I have spoken to a few recently who are not the sort of rah-rah type of like the Jerry fanboys that we see from a lot of Dallas fans. But it's I look at that division and I'll take Philly out of it. Washington clearly looks a lot better. The Giants, even if this isn't the right regime, they're about to get a new quarterback by all accounts. So that at least puts them in position to improve, I would say, because it's hard to get a lot worse than what they've had the last year or two. They clearly believe in what they have in Daboll and Joe Schoen, but we'll see how it develops. But even if they don't, then they can move off those two guys and put them with whoever the new quarterback is that they're going to bring in this offseason. And there's a strong chance that within a year or two, they could be right where Washington is right now. Dallas has shown no willingness to do the executive thing. They've locked themselves in to absurd money at quarterback that at least for another year, they're stuck with that situation, to the point where when I thought Trey Lance coming in a year or so ago was potentially a good successor, they pretty much nuked that idea almost right away. Barely even gave him a chance to show that he could be, show what he could be. Until and even when Dak got banged up, they for the most part pretty much passed him over, which that particularly surprised me. But it just I know that there was a lot of talk this past week about how bad the looks were for the situation with the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Tampa Bay Bucks. I'm going to get into that next with the Liam Cohen saga. But I just don't know how people in that front office can be so, it's not even self-absorbed, just so absolutely disconnected fundamentally from any sort of sense of reality and any sort of sense of tangible empirical evidence that has been existent, since John Elway retired. I do not know what they're looking at that is telling them what's anything different from any piece of data or any sort of viewing, looking with my own two eyes, has been able to deduce, and what's pretty universally looked at through public national NFL media right now as one of the more almost pretty objective considered blunders in recent NFL management history, I guess you'd say. Because I don't see how they're going to improve this situation with the continuing to double down. In fact, I've referenced Colin Cowherd a lot, and Colin Cowherd, I know this is not his quote, like only his quote. I know a lot of people say this, but he's the one I remember saying it. It's fine to make a mistake. Don't double down on being wrong because you're afraid to admit it being wrong. That's basically what the gist of the quote was. I think I'm pretty much sure I'm paraphrasing it, but that was the gist of the quote. Jerry Jones would rather be wrong 100 out of 100 times than admit that he's wrong once. And I just don't know how you make so much money in oil and these other things. I mean, I know a lot of it was already there with his father, but I don't know how you make as much oil money as you do in things like oil and whatnot. Because it's one thing to not know football, which clearly is a significant question when it comes to Jerry. But how are you that successful when it comes to business? And yet, when you do any sort of mildly objective evaluation of what's wrong with your football process and what's wrong with your top-down chain of command in your football structure with the Dallas Cowboys, you are just completely not even tone deaf, just completely not even in, forget about missing, a note or two. You're not even in the right octave. You're not even in the right key. You might not even be on the right instrument. And you're missing it by that much of a measure is just beyond me. Anyway, my buddy Carson's jumping in. He says, "Person." Oh, this is his person turquoise waving. Good luck tomorrow, dude. Carson, I greatly appreciate you. Hope you're doing well. Again, I'm sorry about last week, but like I said, this is how you know that Detroit's taking the next step. When both your coordinators are going to become head coaches in other places, now you got to see what the new coordinators. I know that they just brought up that I think it was their D-line coach to be their new DC, but I'm looking forward to seeing what they're able to do next year with whatever their team looks like, but also with how this new reformed staff looks. So we'll see how that goes. And I appreciate the kind words. I think I probably missed something up here. Okay. Says Jerry did not want a guy that is qualified. He wanted a guy who will just go with whatever Jerry says. Yeah, exactly. Yep. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I certainly couldn't have said it as succinctly as that, as we just saw. WWE Saturday Night Main Event on Peacock is incredible. Can't wait to see the Royal Rumble next Saturday. I'm glad you said that because my best friend down here, she just had me put me on last night to WWE for the first time. I turned it on, and within 30 seconds, I was like, "What am I watching?" Like I was so confused. Excuse me. Like I mean, you might as just well have put me in a foreign country with no map, and I didn't know the language because that is what I felt watching this thing. But I hope to learn about it over the next week because I want to watch the Royal Rumble with her next week. I swear, every week we get one of those safe say that 3 times fast moments, and par for the course. Hey, Swifty Scoops, who is your favorite NHC hire? Excuse me, so far in the NFL. Really appreciate that question. I would absolutely have to go with Las Vegas, bringing in Pete Carroll. I think that he really fits what that team needed from a cultural standpoint. I think that he is somebody who comes in with a track record of success, and this sort of analogy has been made a couple times, and I'm gonna jump in with it as well, just because I don't think I could have come up with anything better than that. But basically saying, stop worrying about putting up the nice artwork and stop worrying about putting in the expensive furniture when you're still worrying about laying the concrete. And that's basically where I think Vegas is at right now. And I think that Pete Carroll, who has proven that he's a great coach when it comes to, especially when it comes to coaching young players, which Vegas is going to have a lot of the next couple of years. They have no idea who or what their quarterback is going to be next year. They clearly have deferred a lot of this from the front office standpoint to Tom Brady, which I don't know if Tom Brady's going to be a good executive just because he's been an incredible quarterback. Obviously, we've seen that doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a great executive. I mean, just look over at NBA with Michael Jordan and Charlotte. But I certainly know that I've seen enough from Mark Davis to know that I already trust Tom Brady more than I trust Mark Davis. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens there. But I would definitely say that I think that he is kind of almost what I saw in Cincinnati this offseason in baseball with Terry Francona. I think that what this represents for where the franchise is and the way that he fits that franchise, not just from an X's and O's standpoint, but from a lead. That's something else I heard a lot this offseason. I heard a lot this offseason about less about X and O and scheme and whatnot, and a lot more talk about management and leader of men and culture. I heard a lot more about that this offseason than I usually. I hear a lot about what was his offense ranked or what was his defense ranked, and one thing or another. This offseason, a lot of these coaching searches, and I knew what was going on to varying degrees in different ones. There were a couple that I felt like I got a little more frequent updates on, and a couple that I felt like were a little more. And then there were a couple that looked pretty much like we knew what was going to happen right away, like the New England one. But I think that he is a good example of that, and I think that I really like most of the head coaching hires that we saw. Other than the Dallas one, the only one I didn't really love was the Jacksonville one, and that was more because of the process through which that happened rather than the coach itself. I'll try and get into that in a moment here, but if not, I might come back to that next week. Mr. Osborne says, hey, okay, here we go. He says, hey there, Swifty Scoops, a little late, was watching another show. Ain't no worries, that's why we're on for an hour. Hope you're doing well, Mr. Osborne, and I hope your hand's doing well. If I remember correctly, I think that was there was supposed to be an update with that this past week, so I hope you're feeling well and on a positive trajectory. Did someone says Cowboys? Hi, Swifty Scoops. Nikki, how you doing? Yep, I told you I was going to be on that tonight, and I mean, you just heard that spiel. I know you've heard most of what I already said, but and you got to hear it again. Scoop, I'm not a fan of the Cowboys head coach hire. I think it's going to be another disaster next season. Yeah, it goes back to the, doing the same thing over and over again is the definition of, insanity or madness or whatever the term is. I feel like I'm watching Sisyphus just push the boulder back up the hill and letting it roll back down and freaking knock him over every single time. And except in this case, he's either too clueless to know that he should stop doing that because he's going to keep getting the same result, or he's too entrenched in his own reflection to realize that he's the one who's causing the problem. And I don't know which is worse. And or the Jets hire. Okay. That was connected. I actually can't find the follow-up message that was. My apologies, Mr. Osborne. Take a look at John Lynch, a great player and a very good GM. My guys, I think Brady can do it. I would have no surprise whatsoever if Brady can be almost like if he could have a career as a Hall of Famer independently, just as an executive, on top of his career as a Hall of Fame quarterback, that would not surprise me at all. All I was saying was that I think that people automatically assume that we can expect greatness from him as an executive because of what he was as a player. And I'm just not willing to make those expectations just yet. But again, Mark Davis has set the bar so low that I could have kicked it walking back to the couch earlier today. So I think that there's very little that he could do that would consider a disappointment. That appears to be the final comment for now. So yes, since I did mention the Jacksonville one, I'm going to jump in on that for those who haven't heard what transpired this past week. So basically what had happened is offensive coordinator for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Liam Cohen, he had agreed in principle to return to the same position with Tampa Bay on a contract that would have made him the highest paid offensive coordinator in football. He informed at that time the Jaguars that he was out of the running. And a lot of people believed that Trent Baalke, the personnel executive for the Jacksonville Jaguars, was the reason why Ben Johnson didn't go there. He was somebody that Doug Peterson, when he first took the job a couple of years ago, he was someone that he was reluctant to work with. And he was somebody that multiple people were believing was going to be an obstruction to getting certain people to come in and want to take the Jacksonville Jaguars coaching job. So after they lost Johnson to Chicago, they ousted Trent Baalke. After ousting Trent Baalke, Liam Cohen suddenly took a second look at the Jaguar job and said, maybe I'll hear them out now. And that's all well and good. There's no real, there's nothing really against any sort of rule or any sort of even really custom to go and sort of change your mind on us on either taking a job or not taking a job, or taking a meeting, not taking a meeting, especially for a promotion in the NFL. But where a lot of the controversy and a lot of the consternation and a lot of the what appears to now be bad blood, there's my Taylor Swift reference to the episode, even though it's my least favorite song. There appears to be some bad blood between those sides now, because to my understanding, Liam Cohen pretty much was supposed to go in and sign his extension with Tampa Bay on Wednesday. They couldn't get a hold of him. He was on his way over to Jacksonville to have another meeting, not returning any messages. Someone else even had sent him a message about potential staff move, wasn't acknowledged. And then they found out going into Thursday, as the calendar, was turning over, they find out that they're losing him and he's going to take the Jaguar job. So it seems far less that it was the job itself than the process through which Tampa Bay lost him and he went to Jacksonville. Kind of reminds me a little bit of what we talked about a couple of years ago with the Arizona Cardinals situation, when Eagles defensive coordinator John Gannon went to Arizona. And the Eagles actually got draft picks from Arizona because of the fact that they had agreed to a deal behind the scenes when it was not permissible to be having interviews and negotiations and whatnot for coaches who were still in the playoffs, which that was the case for the Eagles. That was the year that they went to the Super Bowl and lost to Kansas City. So that whole saga, obviously different details in certain respects, but it does remind me of that in some capacity. So I will be interested to see if a similar if something similar happens with regard to Cohen, or my guess is that it probably won't come to that, because this is not really breaking a league rule. This is kind of just more a decency poor look, and sort of a poor look character-wise. Almost, now that I say it, it may actually another example which may actually be more apropos would be that year that the Colts thought they'd hired Josh McDaniels as the head coach, started lining up that staff, and then found out that Josh McDaniels was going back to New England as the coordinator. So that might have actually been a better example. But needless to say, his transition to Jacksonville and his transition to his first head coaching job, not going over in the best light in as far as PR and public opinion and perception and just general tact is concerned. It remains to be seen if that really sets any precedent with regard to what happens going forward for him in Jacksonville. But definitely not one of the greater notes I've seen a situation like this develop from. But yeah, going back to the original to an earlier question, someone asked who or what my favorite hiring was. I would say, if I had to rank them, I would probably say Pete Carroll first, Vrabel second, just because it's a proven head coach going to a place where it felt almost like, I think it was pretty much, even before that job became available, I think people saw it happening at some point. So that would probably be my second. excuse me. My third, I would be torn between the Jets and the Bears, because I know Aaron Glenn, people kind of were looking at him a little bit sideways after the end of the playoff run for the Jets. But I've heard a lot of positive things about him, not only from a defensive standpoint, but from a leadership standpoint. So I probably would put him. I wouldn't know how to put him versus the situation with the Bears. And then the next two would be Jacksonville and Dallas, because the New Orleans Saints haven't named their coach yet. Ironically, Mike McCarthy is considered to be a favorite for that position. Not a favorite, a finalist for that position, I should say. The two favorites, as of what I last heard, were Dolphins defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver, as well as Giants offensive coordinator Mike Kafka. However, I actually just found out a few moments ago from Nick Underhill. This came out from Nick Underhill that McCarthy remains interested in interviewing for the Saints coaching job. However, there are multiple reports coming in that say that the Saints are believed to be waiting to meet with Kellen Moore, the offensive coordinator for the Eagles. So even though Dallas has filled up their coaching position, it doesn't look like their Eagles are out of the woods to potentially lose their offensive coordinator just yet, which would make yet another loss for the Eagles in terms of their offensive coordinator. They have not gone through 3 full seasons with the same coordinator since Pat Shurmur under the Chip Kelly regime over a decade ago, or almost a decade ago. It was 9 years ago. Mr. Osborne says, time will tell. Scoops on Brady. Mr. Osborne says, kind of stinks the Jets took the Broncos assistant GM. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm going to guess Mugi. Wish him well, though, with the dumpster fire that franchise is in. Hey, sometimes the potential silver lining there is that there's very few places to go but up. And with that, we have passed the buzzer. Guys, thank you so much. It was a very active episode tonight. Saw a lot of our familiar faces. We're back on tonight. We had Mr. Osborne, Carson. Appreciate you chiming in. Nikki, my buddy Trevor was there. Mr. Burns seems like he always finds a way to make it on. And then, of course, my guy Kurt in the very beginning. Appreciated everybody. Appreciate also in the private messages. I appreciate there's been a lot of people, including rival fans, who have been sending me kind messages about the Eagles before tomorrow. Greatly appreciate that. Can't wait for I really hope it's a couple of great games. I genuinely, a couple of years ago, when Philly went to the Super Bowl, there's that game against the San Francisco 49ers where Philly won. I think it was by 34 points. I genuinely hope that that's not how either game goes tomorrow. Either game goes tomorrow. I like when games are competitive. I like when games are intense. I like when games are every play matters, every snap matters, every potential flag or call matters. I hope that that's what we get tomorrow. I hope we get some really good football. I hope we get no ref shows, and I hope we get, of course, above it all, an Eagles NFC Championship for the 4th time in my life. Watching it with 2 of my friends tomorrow. Looking forward to seeing them. Hope y'all enjoy the football. Hope y'all enjoy the company and food and whatever else you got planned for the games. And I'm looking forward to coming back on next Saturday to talk about whatever the outcomes were and the preview the Super Bowl, as well as preview spring training and everything else going on next week. We got 2 trade deadlines in the next couple of weeks, NBA and NHL. So I'll be talking about that as well. In the meantime, have a great week ahead. I'll see you next week. Same Scoop time, same Scoop channel.